tell that we are fast approaching the season of Advent. And I am not talking about the fact that every fourth house is now decorated for Christmas and we have not even carved the Thanksgiving turkey. One of the ways you can tell that we're headed towards Advent is by the tone of our scripture lessons. And it's our Anglican tradition. Our scripture lessons point us not to warm and fuzzy holiday images. They point us to the end times. The end times. And part of the reason for this is to remind ourselves that Jesus is Lord of all. Jesus is Lord of all. And by that I mean that Jesus reigns as King, not just during the good times, but the bad times as well. We live in a world that's been distorted from what God originally intended. You don't really need me to say that, but I will, because I'm up here. You don't have to believe in the fall of Adam and Eve to see that something is bent. We know that something is way, way off. Otherwise, we would not be so horrified by the events of the past several weeks. I kind of always like to turn around and see what's gone on in the previous week. And when I did that, I found out that Tuesday, November 13th, anybody know what Tuesday, November 13th was? Yeah, I didn't either. It was World Kindness Day. Now, think about that. We all forgot World Kindness Day. We didn't even know it existed. World Kindness Day was established 20 years ago to attempt to make the world a better place by celebrating and promoting good deeds, and by promoting and pledging acts of kindness either as individuals or organizations. But I also went back and looked at what was happening in our nation on Tuesday. Now, for me, as a baby boomer, it was a very sad day because Marvel Comics czar Stan Lee, who created such classics as Spider-Man and Black Panther, died. Anybody else in mourning? Okay, thank you. Thank you. I grew up with these comics, and I now stand in line to see his films. Excelsior Stan the Man. Now, he was 95. That was a good, long life. Spider-Man and the Incredible Hulk continued. That was Tuesday. But Tuesday was also the day when CNN filed suit against the White House to protect the First Amendment right to a free press. Okay. But more troubling was what was happening on the West Coast. More troubling was what was happening to our brothers and sisters in California, because that is when we began to understand just the magnitude and the severity of the wild camp fire. And as I was meditating on the sermon, the death count was over 70. This morning I realized it was being pushed up towards 80. This morning, over 1,300 people are missing. 1,300. I can't wrap my mind around that. In today's gospel, Jesus tells us that will come a time of war and rumors of war, that nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There'll be earthquakes in various places. He says this is but the beginnings of the birth pangs. It's the beginning of the end. And it's easy to get stuck in that mindset, especially when we look at the events going on right now in our lives. We say, surely, this is the beginning of the end. Class that Robert Spesser is leading on this wonderful book that even if you're not in class, I really recommend. This wonderful book called The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels by John Meacham. It's a review of the different times in our collective lives when it seemed to be the end of time, and how hope and our better angels prevailed. I highly recommend it. That scripture ultimately tells you the story. The better angels prevail. Several years ago, after a terrorist attack in Paris, our Bishop, Scott Benhays, began our diocesan convention with a moment of silent prayer and then said, "If you do not believe in sin, you haven't been paying attention." And then he added, "If you don't believe in grace, you haven't been paying attention." And that's what I want to focus on today. The grace of Jesus and how that makes a difference in our lives and the lives of others. Now, I am as guilty as anyone on focusing on the dark side and not meditating on how the light of Christ shines in the darkness. And the thing is, Jesus really does shine out. And that is such good news. And don't you think people are hungry for good news right now? Aren't you? Presiding Bishop Michael Curry has said, "Evangelism for the sake of getting people into heaven doesn't interest me as much as getting people out of the hell they're in now." Evangelism for the sake of getting people into heaven doesn't interest me as much as getting people out of hell now. That means sharing Jesus. And it means sharing Jesus' stories in our lives. I say that a lot, I'm saying it again. I once heard the Bishop of Louisiana, the Right Reverend Morris Thompson, share his own Jesus story. He said that on what should have been a normal day, he got a call from his dad. And his dad said, "You need to come home. It's your brother." And what he learned was that his younger brother had committed suicide by stepping in front of a train. And that is the kind of news that derails you. I don't know how much time had passed, but Thompson will tell you that for the longest time, he was stuck in the wreckage of that moment in which he heard, "You need to come home. It's your brother." He went on a retreat, and his spiritual director asked him to take time to go outside and meditate on where his brother was right now. Where his brother was right now. And it was then that he had a vision of Jesus. Jesus was with his brother, and they both were smiling. They both were smiling. And then in that vision, his brother said, "I'm okay now. I'm okay." And then there was dancing in the field. The last words of the vision were, "Gotta go. Gotta go." The vision ended, but not the feeling of being with Jesus, of being with his brother. It was like the old story of the two disciples who were so consumed by the darkness they felt after the death of Jesus. They didn't recognize the resurrected Lord. But he was walking with them, right there with them, on the road to Emmaus. After their eyes were opened to the presence of the living Christ with them, they looked back on that encounter and said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us?" Because that's how it felt to be in the presence of the living Christ. My beloved, that's good news. That's Jesus taking us from the hell in which we find ourselves and lifting us to something that feels like heaven on earth. Next Sunday, we'll be celebrating Christ the King Sunday. It's a day that points to the now and to the not yet. The now is that Jesus is Lord of all. The not yet is that Jesus has not yet come back, when all things will be reconciled to him. The war has been won, but we still live in a battlefield where sin and evil will do their best to make us think that Jesus is anything but the Lord of all hopefulness, the Lord of all joy, whose trust ever childlike, no cares can destroy. Do you have a Jesus story to share? One that will point people to the way out of hell, out of the hell they're living in right now? I know I ask this a lot. In fact, you might think every other sermon Cindy is asking, do you have a Jesus story? And the reason is because it's that important. Not just for me to know, it's that important for your neighbors to know, for your friends to know, for the person sitting next to you right now, for them to know. It's more important than ever. Share your Jesus story. And y'all, you do not need a pulpit to do that. And sometimes this is an obstacle. This comes between people. But in order to share your Jesus story, you need the ears of Jesus to first listen to another person's story. Perhaps listen to their pain. And equally hard is listen to their joy. Listen to their joy. There are not many people we get to share joy with. But listen to them. And then you're going to need the heart of Jesus to love that individual, to love them in their pain, to rejoice with them in their joy. And then you're going to need to be the voice of Jesus. The voice of Jesus speaking into that pain. And it's called being a wounded healer. Henry Allen coined that term a long time ago. A wounded healer. It's following the example of Jesus. The prophet Isaiah predicted that Jesus would be the one by whose wounds we are healed. And from the place of pain can come what we now know as that peace that passes all understanding. The peace that passes all understanding. Too much of what passes for the Christian faith today is a kind of don't worry, be happy kind of theology. And that may work. It may work until you're faced with a wildfire or a hurricane or a mass shooting. It can work until you're faced with a broken relationship or a broken life, because then you see the Christ who was broken for you. For you. There's an old hymn we don't sing very much, but I love the words. I love the truth they tell. Listen. They cast their nets in Galilee, just off the hills of brown. Such happy, simple fisher folk before the Lord came down. Contented, peaceful fishermen before they ever knew the peace of God that filled their hearts, brimful and broke them too. Young John, who trimmed the flapping sail, homeless in Patmos died. Peter, who hauled the teeming net, head down was crucified. The peace of God, it is no peace, but strife closed in the sod. Yet brothers prayed for but one thing, the marvelous peace of God. Yet sisters prayed for but one thing, the marvelous peace